Good morning, everyone. Let's let people trickle in a little bit and kick off very, very shortly. Great. Thank you for your patience. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this third paper launch of our collaboration with the African Climate Foundation. It's a great pleasure to welcome you. I'm here with Alan Wallace from the African Climate Foundation, who will sum things up and moderate questions after we've given a presentation. And my colleagues, Jana van Deventer, who has helped guide this process of 3 papers that we have done with ACF through publication, and Roy Haberman, the CEO of South Africa for Krutham, who was one of the key authors behind this particular paper, and obviously has a long history working in the public sector at national and provincial level. So please do, as usual, tap away in the Q&A, raise hands at the end during the question time. We obviously want as many questions as possible. But we will kick off. Next slide. Yeah, just to reiterate, this is the same company that launched the other 2 reports. We were known as Intellidex before. We're still the same company. We're still 15 years old. We still have a large bench of staff in our Santon office in particular, and a very much South African company working particularly on issues at the intersection of society, politics and finance, which of course just energy transition is the most obvious and pressing current topic in that regard, but now known as Krutham since about 2 months ago. We skip on 2 slides, Jana. Just to recap on the other 2 reports we launched as part of this series. The first one, the theme overall, let's remind ourselves, is scaling finance, given the huge volumes of finance needed for the just transition and relatively limited amount that is notionally available on the surface. So far, our burning platform is we are going on a 30-year transition. We will need deep reforms to our capital markets, to the way we fund. The public sector will not be able to shoulder the full burden of this period. And so we have done now 3 reports. The first looking at capital markets developments that are required to scale private sector finance, particularly for mitigation. We focused on there. We introduced our concepts of transitioning in and transitioning out, and how we think about providing capital to different parts of the transition. Our second paper, then, which was launched earlier this year, focused in on the sort of loose end, if you like, of the challenge of financing the social aspects of the just transition, the social projects in particular, the need to do that with the private sector at scale, given mixed performance that had existed so far in South Africa of jobs bonds and the like, and financing at scale social problems for South Africa's wider issues. And then now this third report picks up on, again, some of the outstanding questions in those first 2 reports around the role of public finance in being able to achieve scale of financing for the just transition. And that's be the focus of our presentation today. Just on to the next slide, there's a recap of just some of the key outcomes from the first paper. We look particularly at barriers to achieving scale, at some of the capital market reforms that would be required, at some of the problems that are thrown up by an ESG lens that sometimes has too much focus on the E, in particular, the problems that are created by this ecosystem in terms of exclusion lists, in terms of the ability to get underlying pools of capital, more passive pools of capital into the just transition, were really the particular issues that were thrown up in the first paper. And we had a list of recommendations there. They included changes to how capital markets function, changes to how we think about ESG financing, and in particular, identifying areas where we can de-risk and where we can blend capital to create some of the scale that is otherwise maybe unachievable to get the private sector to drive overall the shift in jet financing. We need the JSE seminar that many people on this webinar will be aware of that happened last week was actually very interesting in the sense of it was tackling very similar issues and came up with very similar conclusions as we had in our first paper here, in particular around the need for listed instruments, for liquidity, for dealing with problems of hedging and the funding and liquid markets, which really came out from the first paper for the just transition as a whole, but are particularly applicable to transmission now, obviously a particularly key topic overall. Then paper 2, that I said we released earlier this year, focused on the issue that it's exceptionally hard to finance many of these social justice projects, that there are deep problems in terms of information asymmetry, in terms of the ability to do this at scale within capital markets. And we talked about, again, some of the issues that are thrown up by more simplistic ESG frameworks, that there can be ways of solving this through potential de-risking frameworks, that there are models, though, that have worked, including pay for performance, and bonds like that, which have been shown to be successful elsewhere, but have not really occurred at scale so far in South Africa. But the thing that sort of looms over the top of these first two papers, if we skip on now to our third paper, is people assume, and there is a perhaps lazy assumption in many places, that the fiscus can just pick up the loose ends, if you like, whether it's on social financing, whether that's on achieving scale in mitigation or adaptation financing, and that somehow there is this backstop that is there. That's as true with respect to private sector projects as it is with respect to public sector projects. The demand for guarantees, in particular, constantly comes up within the framework of the JET-P discussions. We need to remember we're in an exceptionally constrained fiscal position at the moment. This was true before the recent debates around spending. Given rising debt service costs, we were on a long-term path of squeezing on spending, given rising debt service costs and problems in terms of sustainability of long-term revenue, particularly, obviously, as the social wage increases as well, and much debate, of course, around NHI and other parts of government spending. Basically, the question that comes up, and is why we wanted to write an ongoing platform for the third paper, is can the fiscus basically come to the party or not? And if there are problems, what really do we need to do to solve them? It throws up a lot of issues around bankability of local municipalities, of provinces, and basically, as we'll come on to now in the presentation with Jana and with Roy, we find that some of these assumptions that have been made about the role of the fiscus perhaps need to be inspected very closely and much more challenging than expected. And we make some recommendations, as Roy will outline, in this regard. But I'll hand over to Jan now just to scope out what we have done in paper 3 and the structural report. Over to you, Jana.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the launch of the third and final paper of the series. It's been a very interesting research process. We've learned a lot. We've been grappling with a lot of issues around the just energy transition, and we really hope that this research will make a contribution towards finding some of the solutions that we need to finance the just transition. So in the third and final paper, I just want to talk you briefly through the report structure, what we looked at. So firstly, we considered just setting a bit of the background. So why do we need the just transition or the just energy transition? What is the case for the just energy transition? We looked at some of the spatial aspects that need to be considered for South Africa's just energy transition. We know that some of the provinces will be much more severely affected than others, for example, in Mpumalanga, and of course, some of the transition in opportunities that are available are not necessarily in those provinces that are the most severely affected. So just looking into some of those spatial aspects. And then we also did a closer look at the coal sector in particular. What are some of the nuances and the challenges that are being experienced there? Then, because Mpumalanga is the province in the country that will need the most funding for the just energy transition, we did a deep dive into Mpumalanga, particularly looking at some of the funding requirements to really ascertain what the funding gap is in Mpumalanga, especially what it means for municipalities and what the potential impact might be on municipalities that need to transition out, and also create the activities and the opportunities for transitioning in. And this, of course, is all unfolding against a backdrop of a very interesting and nuanced political economy. So the report really does a deep dive into the political economy of Mpumalanga, some of the conflicting interests in the province, at municipalities, the various stakeholders that will be affected by the transition, and how those nuances are playing out as well. Then we consider what the fiscal measures are. We know that Mpumalanga is the province that will be most severely affected. The municipalities are the ones that are most exposed. Fiscal measures likely need to be channeled through Mpumalanga's municipalities, but there are serious issues that the municipalities are grappling with from a financial position perspective. These municipalities are not in a good financial position. There are a lot of issues around this, and any fiscal options that can be considered will need to be considered against that backdrop. So municipalities are not bankable, which means that there are some serious issues around counterparty risks for municipalities. So with that context in mind, some of the fiscal measures or the fiscal, when we do a deep dive into the fiscal measures that are available, we look at firstly at an outline, then we look at some of the principles of public finance, just to understand what can be used, how it can be used, an overview of the planning and budgeting system of the state. We look at the different instruments that are available for spatially targeted interventions, and then we do a bit more in-depth analysis into the equitable share, conditional grants, and then spending by national departments. And then finally, we consider which tax instruments are available for funding the just transition. Finally, we look at some of the alternatives that are available to fiscal funding. This topic was already covered quite extensively in the first two papers. So in the final paper, we just do a slight recap about the funding sector landscape, and also about mainstreaming debt activities, and in particular, the use of catalytic capital for the just transition, and of course, the role that philanthropies can play in deploying catalytic capital and mainstreaming jet activities. And then finally, there are a few recommendations on how this work can be taken forward and what needs to be done to ensure that we use what limited fiscal funding we have available most efficiently to for the just energy transition. I will now hand over to Roy, who will do a bit of a more in-depth overview of some of the findings, in particular around the fiscal measures. So over to you, Roy.
Thank you very much, Joanna. So yes, one of the big things that we've been looking at is the overall fiscal options that are available for the just energy transition before we zoom into Mpumalanga specifically. And naturally, there are the classic three big areas. The paper goes into a little bit more detail than this, but this gives you sort of a high-level overview of what fiscal measures you might have available. The first are tax instruments, which are often used to change behavior by changing relative prices of activities with high levels of emissions. And as you know, we're a front runner in this area with a well-established set of environmental taxes, including a levy on dirty electricity generation and the carbon tax. So that is a fiscal measure that's designed to sort of, as a carrot, to change behavior. Then there are a set of public expenditure measures, which many countries use, which include subsidies and transfers to regions, firms, and households to support climate reduction, adaptation, and mitigation. We highlight in the paper that South Africa hasn't introduced many direct subsidies at this stage, and certainly that's one of the recommendations that comes out of the paper, is to think through that. One very old subsidy was actually on light bulbs back when there was load shedding in 2008 for the first time, but you can think about how those subsidies can be used to also change behavior and change the use of products. So one can think about that both as an adaptation and a mitigation measure. And then, of course, there are financial incentives for specific activities. So these could be lows, it's very similar in those lines. So you can subsidize electric cars, light bulbs, and so forth. And those you can see as could also be used either as direct subsidies or as tax instruments. On the following slide. So these, I just go through all the ones that we have introduced already. I've spoken to the electricity levy, the carbon tax, the emissions trading scheme, certainly something to think about as we go forward. Public expenditure, there are some guarantees that are used to support the renewable energy procurement program. There are some tax incentives, particularly obviously to encourage people to use renewable energy. And then there are financial incentives and non-based measures. We just highlight the non-based measures, market-based measures here, because obviously the big one are the quantitative emissions targets, which we have agreed to as part of the Paris process. On the following slide, yes, so that gives you a sense of where or what the different fiscal measures are that are available. And what we're going to go through now is in a little bit more detail about how these could be utilized in terms of supporting Mpumalanga. We're going to talk about the equitable share. Sorry, just one back. Equitable share, which is the allocations of national money in terms of the constitution to different provinces, depending on provincial characteristics. Direct conditional grants, which are used for national priorities in provinces, and these come with the conditions, and similarly indirect conditional grants fulfill a similar role, but they're designed somewhat differently. Then, of course, national departments can spend in provinces or can spend in Mpumalanga, and one of the things you can think of, which we go into a little bit more detail in the paper, is, for example, supporting skills programs, particularly, for example, through the Department of Higher Education or through the Department of Basic Education. And then 5, if there are specific tax instruments that could be used at a provincial level. There is the possibility that provinces can raise their own taxes. That is a long, complex process, but certainly not impossible. And that money can also be utilized, obviously, for just energy transition purposes. On the following slide. So these are just sort of the standard set of provincial conditional grants that are available. Won't go into each of these in detail, but this just highlights how they work. These are traditionally come with strings attached in terms of requirements. And so each province has to report back on their conditional grant in terms of how they spend it. Following slide. So this just re-highlights that. And obviously the formula-based allocation rules or based on applications or business plans and allocations on past performance or historical spending. This is quite a powerful tool from national government in terms of thinking through what the sorts of formulas that could be used for allocations. They don't necessarily have to follow strict historical spending levels, but you could envisage conditional grants from national based on a province's desire to change their use of carbon, for example, or you could allocate conditional grants to provinces based on the need to do a transitioning in or transitioning out. You could also do allocations on the basis of applications or business plans. That's very, very rare and not really encouraged. And then you could do allocations based on past performance or historical spending. In this case, what often happens with conditional grants is that provinces that are able to spend their conditional grants tend to get more conditional grants, whereas provinces that struggle tend to not. And then, as I've said, there's issues around spending by national department and then tax instruments. On the following slide. Okay, so this kind of gets us to some of the recommendations that I've already touched on, which is that we do raise revenues nationally for specific climate-related issues. We don't recommend a strong ring fencing of tax revenues for the just energy transition. The paper goes into a lot of the complexities of ring fencing. It's generally regarded as not the best fiscal tool. because there can be a number of different, it can create wrong behavior, for example. Particularly if you ring fence money and it's sent directly to affected provinces or municipalities, there's very little that you can do about monitoring and evaluation of the money. And so we don't recommend a strict ring fencing, but definitely do recommend consideration to be given to using the money that is coming from particularly the carbon tax, but any one of the other taxes as a means to unlock revenues for the just energy transition. This will have to be designed very, very carefully because of the number of the issues that we raised in the report around the lessons and the problems with ring fencing that can happen already. And the second big recommendation is about municipalities' creditworthiness. Now, I think this is quite an obvious point, but we do go into quite a lot of detail in the paper analyzing the different municipalities and their creditworthiness at the moment. And the most affected municipalities, Imalahleni and Steve Tshwete, unfortunately have very poor credit histories and have very bad audit outcomes. This will affect their own ability to raise funds off their own balance sheets in terms of the transition. And I think very obviously one needs to strongly, in any case, deal with the municipalities' creditworthiness. And indeed, that's actually one of the things that the paper really grapples with, is that if the affected municipalities were potentially to be very creditworthy, had strong cash flows and strong income streams, you could certainly see them playing a much stronger role in terms of the transition. It has happened in other countries that the municipalities themselves, because they are affected in a variety of different ways by the transition, that they are very forward-looking and they have complex, very detailed development plans to reduce their reliance on employment and revenue from these activities, and have a plan in terms of transitioning out to other activities. So unfortunately, because of the creditworthiness problem in these municipalities, the transition may actually exacerbate the problem, because many of their corporate tax streams may start declining. And so they really do need to think ahead. And some of them have done some excellent work. So there are a number of IDP plans that have been developed for them. Then obviously strategic leadership from the affected provinces. There is a lot that the province itself can do. And so we do recommend that the provinces do think very carefully about how to do that. And the fourth one is about the coherent decommissioning schedule. So it's quite difficult to plan, I think, for the affected provinces, particularly for Mpumalanga and for specifically some of the municipalities, when the decommissioning schedule is a little bit uncertain and unclear, and also what is going to happen when decommissioning happens. There's obviously an argument to be made that the process of decommissioning should include a strong just component, or at least a skills development plan or a plan for the communities, or even as has been suggested in some instances, a plan to very actively bring communities along with decommissioning, and that's certainly something to think about. The fifth is around blended finance solutions. I think, as Peter said in his introduction, we've done quite a lot of work around that. There are a number of blended finance solutions that are available and that can be deployed to the province. And these could be deployed either by a central just energy transition mechanism or a facility, or by DFIs directly, or by provinces, or by philanthropies themselves. Then the other thing which we have done quite a lot of work on, and there is quite a lot of discussion on this in other papers we've done, and we've also, as part of the overall process, is to understand exactly what the funding requirements are and what is available for transition funding. I think one of the areas is uncertainty about exactly what types of money are available and how they can be used. And then that links directly to the seventh recommendation, which is also work that we're doing in parallel, which is how do you enhance the accessibility of mechanisms used to channel just energy transition funding. Now, there certainly seems to be a lot of just energy transition funding available, but it's unclear at this stage how that funding can actually get to a project. And that is in part, as I think was outlined in the introduction also, is that it's very clear to us that there is a pipeline problem. And so even in Mpumalanga, I mean, we did a lot of theoretical work in this paper about thinking about how you could get money to affected communities in a province or to affected municipalities or to affected province. But that does assume that there's a project on the other side that is ready to be funded. So, for example, if there is a decommissioning schedule, then it sort of assumes that there is something on the other side to which the funds can go. And we have highlighted, I think, in some other work that we've been doing, is that many other of these just energy transition mechanisms internationally have put quite a lot of onus on the centralized body or the central mechanism to actually go and find projects, and not only find projects but also develop them, which we would in this country call classic project preparation. And so that is part of the whole idea of wrapping in and enhancing its accessibility of mechanisms. So I'm not quite sure what's happened there. But just to go to the final recommendation, then, thanks very much, Anna, is the obviously proactive engagement by labor. Sorry, I think that one has been doubled up accidentally. Then, sorry, I think that's the last one actually means proactive engagement with communities, which is obviously a very important component of this overall energy transition process. I mean, it's really interesting, and I think this is one of the things that the paper is so useful at highlighting, is that we can sometimes talk about the just energy transition in a sort of very theoretical way, where we think about the energy transition as being something that is happening somewhere. The paper really highlights the fact, and many other pieces of research very much in this line, highlights the fact that the implications of the just energy transition are actually going to be felt in a very discrete set of municipalities, and the negative implications potentially of the transition from an economic perspective will be felt in a very discrete set of municipalities. Projects should thus be sort of targeted on those very discrete set of municipalities. And actually, we highlight in the paper, we go into quite a lot of detail about how different municipalities will be affected and where they'll be affected. And we've got a bit of data in terms of the employment levels per municipality and so forth. And that actually is, I think, one of the big things that also comes out of this is that also requires proactive engagement with communities. And then on the following slide, this really changed. Yeah, so these I think I will hand back over to Peter just to talk us through the final slides.
Thank you, Roy. So I think we set ourselves this challenge in this paper of looking at this sort of assumption that is often out there in the South African discourse that somehow Treasury, the fiscus broadly, can come in and pick up the pieces, whether that is to de-risk, whether that's to provide a guarantee, whether that's to get involved with addressing fundamentally need, as Roy said, need that comes up in highly localized areas. And the very simple answer is that this is not automatically going to happen. This is beyond the simple fiscal constraint. The current way that transfers work needs to be molded more carefully to JET. Now, there is generally resistance from Treasury for doing these types of things in terms of one-off sort of interventions or particular policy flavors of the day. But I think we would posit that the just transition as a 30-year pathway requires deep institutionalization, requires sticky long-term solutions, and where we think changes to previously sort of sacrosanct ways of doing things needs to be fundamentally addressed. Now, this is particularly obvious, obviously, in terms of decommissioning and the impact that has, but also in terms of adaptation and resilience. We mentioned in the report, obviously, the KZN floods of last year, obviously topical today now with what has happened in the Western Cape and parts of the Eastern Cape. Again, highly localized powers and responsibility for spending, for planning, really comes down to municipalities. And I think we're going to see a very unfortunate split potentially in terms of outcomes of people's ability to deal with the impacts of climate change in South Africa, depending obviously on municipal capacity, planning, the ability to budget and use money appropriately. And I think that's why we need to think about these more wholesale structural changes that maybe can push down from a national level through the Auditor General in particular and the work of the Auditor General, ways of municipalities and provinces in particular thinking about capacitation, about planning, and about how they do budget off the back of that. And ultimately, there are many role players here that all have to move in tandem in order to be able to utilize any new regime that is fundamentally put in place. But I think we want to really reinforce that the status quo is that the fiscus will not magically arrive at the party. I think people know that on a national level, but in particular at local level, this is not necessarily going to be the case without deep change. As Roy highlighted, and just on to the next slide, Jana, the report goes into an awful lot of detail to really establish a sort of localized set of issues in Mpumalanga as a particular point of focus. This is not exclusively about Mpumalanga. The adaptation problem is a lot broader. Dealing with migrant labor and other things that may well come from decommissioning is obviously a wider thing. But we really wanted to use the example in the report of Mpumalanga just to focus in on how hard this is. And given so much donor money, so much JET-P money, grant money, and private sector interest is focused on the province. We haven't rehearsed in this presentation today a lot of the underlying facts I think will be well known to listeners on the call, that Mpumalanga has a 4 percentage point higher unemployment rate than much of the rest of the country. But some of the particular details I think in the report are maybe slightly new to the debate. In particular, the depth of the problems of capacity in many of the provinces in Mpumalanga that come out in terms of Auditor General qualification findings, etc., become very, very important when we're thinking about how projects are structured, how grant money is deployed in particular, and that lens I think is often missing. We can't see likely Mpumalanga munis going to banks to structure large long-term sort of borrowings, that sort of thing, for undertaking their own plans and to plug funding gaps in the short term, maybe before grant money becomes available, etc. That's not really possible in the case of many of these places. That's why we really focus, because that then requires you to think about those deeper structural underlying changes that are required. So the full report, Kelly's put in the chat a link there. We obviously welcome any questions now, any feedback afterwards as well, of course, is very much welcome. But there's a lot of detail I think to dive into. We wanted to give an overview of things as opposed to getting lost maybe in some of the tighter detail in terms of the presentation, but very happy, Alan, to take some questions and to dive in things in a bit more detail.
Thanks very much, Peter, Roy, and Jana. And I'm now going to give an opportunity to participants on the call to maybe put some questions out. There are none in the Q&A at the moment, but if there are any questions, maybe take a couple of rounds. Is there any specifics on the content of the report and the recommendations, or any reflections? So. Give it a couple of minutes. I'm just trying to see. The hand is raised. Fiona. Just checking whether or not questions are. If Kelly, can you support unmuting those who would like to raise some questions?
Can you hear me now?
We can. Over to you, Fiona.
Hi. This is such an interesting report for us. I am with an outfit called Oxfecker's Investigative Environmental Journalism. We have been working for the past year on mapping and tracking renewable energy projects in Mpumalanga, and also the decommissioning of coal-fired plants. We're launching our tool next week, which gives users easy access to the information and the data that we've managed to compile in the province. It's called Power Tracker, and if I may, I will share a link to it shortly. Basically, we've been using research also to write up journalistic investigations related to the data that we've managed to put together. The question I'd like to ask this panel, and we obviously haven't had the chance yet to read this report and its findings and recommendations, particularly in connection with Mpumalanga. But the overall impression that I have had after a year of working on this project is that the province is doomed. What I am seeing is that we are going to, in Mpumalanga, and I live in Mpumalanga, have a province where we have a lot of abandoned coal mines and a big mess that will be left behind by mining as investment in coal tails off in coming years, and that there is very little investment in renewable energy taking place in the province. So I guess what I'd like to ask to members of this panel is whether they see a brighter future for Mpumalanga going forward, or whether our overall impression is an accurate one or an inaccurate one. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Fiona. I have two more questions. Should we take a round of questions, or would you like to respond to this question and then we move on to the next questions?
Let's do them individually, I think. Break the South African curse of groups of questions. I think that's a really important question. And I think there is, in the debate, often too much assumption, and this has been the case, I think, in JETP in particular, that we will solve all these problems, right? And we will deal with everything. And I think one has to have a slightly a slightly more realistic view that there are going to be deep problems given the scale of what we're trying to tackle here. I think when one considers that when we went through the municipalities and the province, we basically saw none of them as bankable to the private sector. We saw basically almost none of them able to get additional guarantees, say, from National Treasury. There's a table actually in the report. NDB and DFI financing and even philanthropy financing was probably impossible in most of them, with maybe the exception of Steve Swete. I think that's the burning platform, right, for the issues here. And I think the underlying context in terms of failure in municipalities, obviously, which is a much broader topic, obviously beyond the transition, but the transition is an accelerant, obviously, particularly in Mpumalanga, if not addressed correctly, is that the Treasury does not provide bailouts. The Treasury does not come in and splash around a load of cash to rescue municipalities that get into problems. It restructures them. It sends in teams, and provinces do as well, to right-size them. But there is not free money available, right, as part of this natural process when municipalities get into problems. And I think, again, that is maybe sometimes lost in the debate, and why we need to think about these broader and underlying changes, such as how you, as Roy was saying, how you direct funding as part of the equitable share, based on the requirements of the just transition, based on changes in need that result from that, how you need proper planning around local development and appropriate funding off the back of that, is key as well. So I think that question is very useful to refocus us on the very severe risks actually that are here if these changes don't happen.
Thanks very much. I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to weigh in. Otherwise, I've got 3 more questions in the wings. So if you're happy for me to move on, I will ask Deepak Patel to raise his question. I think you're unmuted, Deepak.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thanks to the Krutham team. I'm from the Presidential Climate Commission. This report is very welcome, and it does resonate with work that the PCC is doing as well on just transition financing mechanisms. We'd like to explore how this report can, in fact, be more than just aligned, but also bring in some perspectives into our approach to just transition financing. It strikes me that this particular report hones in quite quickly, firstly on the just energy transition, rather than boiling the ocean with respect to the just transition. That's a comment. Question with respect to that issue is going to be as follows. Clearly, the intention to decommission, when and if we finally do that, is spoken for in the JET IP with fairly substantial resources, arguably within the boundaried area of the power station, which is going to be decommissioned, and with some both financial resources in the form of grants, as well as some sense that the just elements associated with the decommissioning would fall into a localized understanding of what a possible economic recovery and diversification plan might be. Like to hear the team's view with respect to how to articulate, however limited it might be, those grant components for maximum impact. That's the first question. The second question is, it seems to me that the team has a view that it must be municipalities through which public resources need to find their way towards financing, packaging, etc., just transition projects or programs associated with the JET. Am I reading this correctly or incorrectly? And is there perhaps not a more creative way of ensuring that we are able to attract, crowd in, and therefore aggregate capital from various other sources in a bid to maximize the scalability and therefore the quantum of resources available? I'm not even going to talk about issues related to governance that are embedded in the comment that I've just made in the question that I've just asked. Finally, with respect to other elements of the transition, not just the energy transition, is that outside of the scope of this work, or are there some lessons to be gleaned from this very focused report on energy transition for that area? Or at least I wouldn't say our, because we haven't taken it through the PCC yet. My perspective is that when it comes to adaptation and resilience, we are going to face an even bigger intractable problem of the fiscal incapacity to finance that. And I don't see any ready takers in whatever form and whatever blend to finance adaptation and resilience, which is in fact going to become more and more critical as climate change impacts various subregions of South Africa, which might not be correlated with or very neatly fit in spatial profile over the decarbonization of our electricity system. Thank you.
So a few questions there, Peter, Jana, and Roy. Who would like to kick off?
Thank you, Deepak, for a very detailed set of questions. I think just on the framing of JET versus just transition, the paper series originally was conceived as JET, but we have very much, I think, started to depart from that into the broader transition. And I think all these issues are very much applicable, or more so, as you say, in some cases when we think about resilience and adaptation. I think, Roy, maybe do you want to pick up on this issue of locating policy solutions, if you like, through municipalities, as opposed to be able to do it through other methods? And I'll pick up on some of the other points.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I mean, I think it's a very good question. I mean, I think you know, this is, as you know, we've highlighted sort of one of a series of papers, and so it zooms in on specifically on, if one were to follow that particular way, how would you deal with it at a localized level? Is there capacity in municipalities, for example, to borrow for transition activities? We found in the paper there isn't. Is there perhaps other ways of getting to municipalities? So I think, to answer that question, we're not suggesting that this is the only way. I think what we're trying to highlight in this paper is to explore that as one of a particular set of questions that need to be answered. And so I think, Deepak, the idea is really to see the paper within the context of the overall series, if that makes any sense.
I think just to follow on that, I mean, if we think about how government spending is broken down, right? You know, there is a very substantial chunk of spending goes right to provinces and to municipalities. Now, a large part of that is for health, is for education, but you know, the government only partially works on a sort of centralized model. One would hope, local input, local planning in particular. Now that's clearly problematic given these capacity issues that we raise. And there's clearly roles for the PCC, for ESCOM, for others to be able to try and insert that plan to a degree. But someone has to ultimately take ownership of this. And within the existing system, money is generally funneled, via equitable share and by other sort of conditional grants into that level. Now, there's a question: how much do you want to change the existing status quo of how the fiscus works, right? And I think that's an issue we do grapple with in the paper. And our idea is more to work within the existing framework and certainly propose some quite radical changes about how we prioritize the need through the just transition into that, as opposed to completely starting from scratch. Jana, maybe you just want to reflect on the sort of grant component issue, the challenge, I think, of that going into some of these areas that we found, and particularly on philanthropies as well, have similar sort of bankability problems as banks even.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. So I think in terms of how grants should be used, and I think this is a very important point to get across. And if you look at the series of papers, and particularly in paper 2, there was a very strong focus on the transitioning in versus transitioning out aspect, so activities that qualify as either transitioning in or out. And the reality is that some of the elements that need to be funded simply cannot be funded by commercial capital in its current state. So we need philanthropies and perhaps even some fiscal funding to come in and get those projects from not being bankable or commercially viable to being bankable. And the use of catalytic capital can play a key role in how you do that. So catalytic capital is just a fancy word for risk capital. It's capital that can come in and really de-risk the project to ensure that it can ultimately mobilize funding at scale from commercial investors as well. And there are various ways in which that can be done, and different roles that capital and philanthropies in particular can play to support the process of getting projects from where they are at the moment to where they need to be in order to really unlock financing at scale. I think it's really, really important to keep in mind the enormous scale of financing that we need for not just the energy transition, but for the economy-wide transition that South Africa needs to undergo in order to get to a sustainable, carbon neutral green economy where everyone can participate in. So it's really about thinking what that role is for philanthropies, how they need to get involved in order to ultimately unlock the private capital that is where there are way more resources than in either fiscal or in development funding. So yeah, to see how they need to play that role.
I think that's come up in previous discussions on the previous 2 papers as well, Deepak, in terms of, we can double the amount of grant financing in JETP, right? But it's sort of drop in the ocean versus the amount of money required for a multi-trillion rand, 30-year transition, overall. And I think that's, again, why we focus in on capacity issues, on bankability issues, as being so important in the medium run. But those bankability issues are exactly the same that a philanthropy or a grant maker faces, right? If there isn't the capacity there and you have a disclaimed audit, you're at best going to get a fraction of the money that you might otherwise get from a philanthropy or a grant giver.
Thank you. So we have 8 more minutes and I think 3 more questions. So one is in the Q&A chat, so please have a look at that, panelists. But Mandy, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Alan. Can you hear me?
We can.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. So thanks for this. And the first 2 papers are great, and looking forward to reading this one. There's just 2 issues I wanted to raise, and based on this last discussion, there's always this tension between grant financing and concessional financing, and in the real world, nobody's going to give us free money to do this. We can have some grant financing to do some of the pre-feasibility, feasibility work and things that are required, but we absolutely have to look at these other alternative ways of financing that you mentioned in the presentation. I was interested to hear whether you looked at, in your blended finance model, whether you looked at carbon credits as a way to attract private sector financing. Because if we're able to attract some philanthropic financing to do some de-risking, or multilateral bank financing to do de-risking, it is a way then to also create an enabling environment to create carbon credits that the private sector could then play into. So just curious whether you looked at that. And then my second question was, when I was involved in the JET work in Mpumalanga, one of the biggest concerns we heard from the local municipality was that they hardly ever heard from national. So whereas a lot of the funders, whether it was grant financing or concessional financing, approached national treasury or national government with offers to finance some of the just energy transition work, that never filtered down to the provinces and to local municipalities. I'm just wondering whether you found that communication gap as well, and that I know this paper is about financing, but there should be a recommendation, I think, around that and how the governance of these conversations happens, because I do think there is a lack of communication between national, provincial, and local government. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you. Peter.
Thank you, Mandy. I think that communication point comes out really strongly in the report to a degree, where we say someone ultimately has to take ownership, right, for these sorts of things. And that's where, whether it's COGTA, whether it's the Auditor General, following up on people's municipality and provinces' development plans, integrated planning processes becomes exceptionally important. And someone has to ultimately have ownership, right? And we have not seen ownership at national level, particularly for the just side of the transition, occurring to a great enough degree. And I think that's filtered through into the financing as well, and why the discussion we're trying to launch. So this is the first time we think people have really had this type of discussion on how fiscal financing really happens and in different modalities in the transition. Lodging this as a conversation between affected areas, their municipalities, their province, and Treasury is the start of that process, I think, to create transparency and communications. But I think that's a very good point. Roy, do you want to deal with the point on carbon credits?
Yes, thanks, Peter. Sorry, my camera is playing up a bit. Yes, for sure. I mean, it's an excellent idea. I mean, I know National Treasury is looking at the carbon credits market. I think, Mandy, as you know better than most, I mean, it's certainly one way that you could quite easily not need the fiscus at all to sort of create a very straightforward way of unlocking financing. Certainly, I think a number of carbon credits could be unlocked through many of the decommissioning processes. Commodity obviously could unlock a huge number of carbon credits if we had a well-designed system. And obviously we have to look very carefully at the different problems with the existing system. So will we allow leakage of carbon credits or not? There are positives and negatives to that. How do we price carbon credits? And I do think that it's very much something that naturally follows on from the carbon tax. And certainly I know National Treasury has been thinking quite a lot in that line. And perhaps that's one big area of further work to look at, which is exactly how one could design a carbon credits market in a way that would support the transition.
Thanks very much. I think there's still a few questions, and if the panelists are keen to continue, I'd like to take the rest of the questions that have come in. I think there's some really good discussions coming in. So if we can go on for a couple more minutes for those that can stay on. So I'm going to ask Thabo to come on in.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Thabo. I write for Oxpackers. I've written quite a number of stories, which are on our website at Oxpackers and also published with the Mail and Guardian. Surely Peter and Roy in this call, they do know me, and Mandy, by the way, Deepak too, by the way. So the question that I'm yet to ask, I think it's not specifically for Intellidex, but I see a number of people here who have experience in this. Anyone can answer it. So my stories, especially those who are talking more about finances, they've been focusing on how we get the money, the grants and the loans. And once we get those, where do they sit? And you will see my latest story, which we published on Friday. It's in the MNG, and it's also our latest story on the Oxpackers website. My understanding as a journalist here, remember the stories that I write, they need to have a balance. People obviously in this call should be able to understand the stories, because most I obviously get the information from you people, but they should also have a balance to the people on the ground, people who are affected in the communities. They should understand what is happening in these articles. So now, my understanding from where I sit is that when we have the money and the money sits with the treasury, that's where it actually ends. From the treasury, the money is going to flow and the transition is going to be simple, right? But when I listen to you and look at your slides, you are saying there's a problem with bankable municipalities in Mpumalanga. Now that gives me another picture to say, okay, even if the treasury we can have the money that is sitting with the treasury, it's not going to be easy to make the funds flow for the transition if there's this kind of the problems in the municipalities. So if I understand it that way, that means the issue now becomes a bit complicated for our readers, the ordinary people. So I need you to give me some kind of an explanation that where does this all connect? If we do have the money that's in the treasury, why is it difficult now for it to flow to the municipalities so that we can have a transition? Where does the issue of municipalities and that are not bankable fit into this whole equation?
Thank you, Talbot. I think the issue here really is the sort of status quo, if you like, versus how it was meant to be, right? I mean, the conception, I think, at the start of JET-P in particular was that financing would flow to ESCOM, municipalities, to various other places. And in reality, all the funding so far under JET-P has flowed into international treasury. We're waiting, obviously, on some bilateral ESCOM loans in particular, but these bankability problems that have come up are forcing basically the money to come into treasury, and that creates, I think, a lot of issues, about how it is sort of on lent. If it is on lent, if it comes out in grants, that's not entirely clear. There's been no transparent framework really published about how you utilize treasury as a conduit in this regard. But we're ultimately talking, I think, in the report about something bigger, though, than this problem of where, for instance, JET-P and other sort of financing actually goes. Is it direct or via Treasury? We're talking also about, you know, how you fundamentally can tilt the scales or the balance, if you like, of where Treasury decides to put money around the country based on this new big need ultimately of the just transition. And that is a slightly, they're very interlinked, to be clear, but that is a slightly separate topic of conversation. But you raise a very important point here, I think, about the difficulties of funders finding counterparties, and the way Treasury currently operates is leading to this concentration of funding currently into national Treasury. Roy, maybe you could just pick up, I think, just to answer verbally, one of the questions in the chat is very useful on what the recommendations are to improve creditworthiness of municipalities. This is a huge, obviously wider than jet issue, which I know, given your prior experience, you've been very involved in at the practical end of things as well.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I mean, I think that goes directly to the sort of the comments I was making earlier, and that arises in two spaces. So the one is to unlock much of this international financing that is available for the transition. There, obviously, international finances, DFIs, even philanthropies, etc., are very concerned about not only the creditworthiness of municipalities, but their audit outcomes. And we note in the paper that many of the affected municipalities have very weak audit outcomes. And that does suggest that they will struggle to even get philanthropic money, I can never quite pronounce that one, or concessional finance. And similarly, the Treasury is also very reluctant to make special allocations to those municipalities for the same reasons, which is that I think Treasury's view is certainly what it appears to be, is that Treasury is very much against bailing out municipalities financially, and particularly even more strongly against bailing out municipalities with weak audit outcomes. And so the first step must be to improve those audit outcomes. And a variety of provinces have taken different paths on this. In the Western Cape, when there was a problem about 10 or 15 years ago with audit outcomes in some municipalities, there was a very strong drive from the centre to improve that. That you can kind of see as a proactive measure, improve audit outcomes, implement financial systems, improve the capability of municipal managers and CFOs. In many of these municipalities, you find municipal managers and CFOs that simply don't have the qualifications or the experience to run very what are quite large budgets. And then also sort of a program of support to proactively deal with it. There is also reactive measures, and that actually has happened already in Mpumalanga. And actually, that was one of the big test cases of this, which is to essentially place the municipality under administration. And then as part of the administration process, you develop what's called a financial recovery plan with a financial recovery practitioner appointed either by the province or by the national government, who then has quite sweeping powers in order to the ability to essentially begin a process of restoring the financial health of municipalities. Now, we certainly aren't recommending that that's what you do in this case. I think what we're recommending in this case is more the proactive part, so improving the capabilities of municipal managers and CFOs. There's a whole bunch of work being done at national about improving revenue collection, improving cost control, and so forth and so forth, and that can actually restore not only creditworthiness but financial health of these municipalities, which will put them in a much better state to be able to raise financing.
Thank you, Roy. We go into just to share a slide very quickly, we go into quite a bit of detail in the report looking at what financial health of municipalities actually is. I'm hoping that is showing up there. And we go through this whole sort of checklist across the different municipalities around all the outcomes, around creditor payment periods, around if you're in arrears to ESCOM, these sorts of things. And this is basically your sort of shopping list for taking corrective action going forwards in terms of improving health. It ultimately comes down to political will at a municipality, at a province, nationally, as Roy was very much implying. We then in the report, just to highlight this table, work that financial health into basically bankability assessments through different means, and that's why I was sort of highlighting earlier some of the skepticism of bankability, particularly the private sector, based on those previous health and sort of audit outcome checks that we did across key Mpumalanga municipalities. So this is an example of some of the detail we go into in the report, but again, very much applicable beyond obviously Mpumalanga in particular.
Thank you, Peter. I think mindful of time, I think maybe we'll take one more question that came in before we reached the top of the hour. Lisa, oh, your hand is dropped. Oh no, it's still there. Lisa Chamberlain, over to you.
Thanks, Alan. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Lisa. I'm with the Environmental Justice Fund. And I wanted to ask the panel to just elaborate a little bit on the point you made earlier about the importance of community participation. And I'm asking this because it's top of my mind at the moment. I've just returned from Climate Week in New York, where the South African JETP process is being, I witnessed it a couple of times in climate financing discussions, being held up as a best practice example of an inclusive and participatory process. And certainly it's been more inclusive and participatory than other processes we've seen in the past. But I think if communities in South Africa on the Highveld and elsewhere, heard the glowing terms in which it was being described, they would be quite concerned. And certainly that concern, I think, resonates with the evidence we're seeing in our processes, where about 80% of the rapid response funding that we are issuing is going to participatory requests for communities that are being informed at the very last minute about meetings and opportunities to participate, and are needing kind of support to get there. And so, I think just in the interest of time, I think we can take the why of the importance of community inclusion in these processes as a given. But what I'm interested to hear more of from the panel is your advice about where you would see the critical access points for communities. What would your advice be in terms of climate financing processes in particular? Which processes would you see them, would your advice be about engaging in, which set of stakeholders and when?
Great. No, I think that's a very important question. I'll hand over to Jana. I think if you also look at our second paper, we touch on this a lot, but Jana can answer this.
Sure. Thanks, Peter, and thanks for the question, Lisa. And just to sort of say this, that I completely agree that more needs to be done from the community engagement perspective. I think it all starts with really being intentional about including the community, and it not being just a tick box exercise, but to have it as, to strategically embed it in the process, and to make sure that as with all the other plans, that there's a very strong proactive plan to ensure that you engage the community, the right people within the community, and that you can really include their voice. And I think it's as Peter mentioned in the second paper, so some of the, we consider community voice as being one of the key 3 elements that is required to ensure that we can have a economy-wide just transition. I would also like to point you to the work that's being done by the Impact Investing Institute. They've created also some elements and criteria around how you can include that community research in the next couple of weeks as well, around strategically ensuring that there's a very proactive community engagement and approach that is being taken. I don't have all the answers for you straight off the bat, but I do think that it's a topic that there's also room for more research in terms of how this can be done and how it should be done right, so that we don't sit in 10 years' time and look back and say we should have done it this way or this way, to ensure that we got the communities along, and that there was a co-creation process between both the funders and the the folks that are designing the projects and the initiatives that are attempting to ensure that we engineer a just transition, but that we really take that bottom up rather than a top down approach to ensure that the community voice is included in the solutions, and that the folks that are being the most severely affected by the just transition also are brought along the journey.
Thank you, Jana. I think that's partly why, again, we come back to the issue of municipalities. I think around pure decommissioning, maybe national can deal with your individual local areas and communities, and that you're talking about a smaller area, but I think even that overstretches things. But when we talk about broad scale resilience and adaptation beyond just energy transition, the national government cannot deal with the entire country of their relatively different risks. Is it drought, or is it floods, etc., or and the individual needs? You're going to have community voice expressed in a very particular way, into local structures, into municipalities, well capacitated and well planned municipalities, I think. And again, that comes back to this point of how you can include them in the right place for that actually to work, as opposed to, as Jan says, being maybe just a tick box exercise.
And I know that we've run over time, but if I can maybe just add a quick practical example of a fund that's really done a good job at including community voice. So Blue Orchid, they've designed insurance products for climate adaptation, and the way that they ensure that they've got a community voice included in their solutions is that they actually survey the folks that are being affected by climate change to get an understanding of what it is that they need, and where what type of products need to be designed. So we are starting to see some examples of not just community engagement at a public sector level, but also how private sector investors, for example, that are crafting solutions and products and services are including the community's voice when they are designing their solutions.
Thanks, Jana. Maybe just before we wrap up, maybe Roy can just take the quick question in the chat, in the Q&A on pipelines, because this question has been a thread in the background through much of the discussion. I think obviously, again, somewhat bigger than the paper in and of itself, but is very important, right, Roy, in terms of the problem of moving a bankable pipeline.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, and I think the Oxpec's initiative is excellent in that regard. I mean, I think one of the big problems is this information asymmetry problem, where you have got a large amount of international money, donors often in the global north, who don't necessarily have just insight and knowledge into what sort of projects they can support, what community initiatives are around, and that's in the small project level. So thinking about small skills initiatives, perhaps for affected communities around decommissioning sites. And that also even converts into very, very large transitioning projects. For example, the commodity decommissioning, if for argument's sake, includes a component of converting the facility into a new green energy facility. Let's just use it hypothetically. I mean, that's an enormous financial undertaking. And who actually brings forward that idea? Who puts in the money and the capital required to do the feasibility studies? Who draws up the plans? Those are very expensive. I mean, certainly the experience of national government in terms of things like the budget facility for infrastructure is that an application to the budget facility for infrastructure can cost 20-30 million rand. And that might seem like a very large amount, but if you think that the project itself is a multi-billion rand project, for example, a new road or a new interchange, then National Treasury is not going to fund something if it hasn't been a very comprehensive feasibility study done, and when the money is applied for, that people are aware that that the project is actually going to make a difference. So that does require resources, and I certainly think that one thing to think about is to create a dedicated project preparation facility window for funding of projects. Secondly is to provide technical skills and capacity to projects for understanding how to make these applications, who to talk to, where money is available, and so forth. And then thirdly, to actually go out and sort of hunt for projects and work with communities to create projects that could be brought forward. I mean, those are just three potential ideas. But yeah, certainly, as Peter says, that has come up quite a lot in the work we've done on this, which is to create a proper an approach to project preparation.
Thank you, Roy. But no, this is a never-ending question. People have seen the New Development Bank comments during the BRICS Summit. They were struggling to find projects themselves because of project prep and bankability, and we'll be writing a lot more about this, I think, in the future. But back to you, Alan. Thank you.
Great. Well, a big thank you to Jana, Peter, and Roy taking us through this, and thank you to everyone who's stayed on a little bit longer. I think this is a very big topic, and I think very hard to cover all the issues in an hour. But I think definitely some common strands coming through, and I think we have between implementation and how we start getting things moving on the ground, and questions of capacity, capability, and improved modes of participation in this process. So I think from our side, from the ACF, this is an issue of how we now take the recommendations and start actually driving them, and who needs to drive them. And I really hope that after this call, that those are on this call will continue to engage with both Krutham and with ACF. I think our doors are open as we're looking at ways to see what's next. How do we take a recommendation and go from rhetoric to reality? And I think the evidence, particularly from Oxpeckers and from the Environmental Justice Fund, on how individuals are experiencing the transition, it's critical information, because I think it's very hard to go from the macro level about leaving no one behind to saying, well, how do you actually make sure that happens in reality? So I think from our side, a big thank you, and I hope that the conversation keeps going. And please engage further with the report and the recommendations. So thank you for joining us, and let's definitely keep this conversation going.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.